Okay. Okay, so the beginning of chapter 8, volume 3 begins with Mr. Bennett regretting not putting aside money um, for his family in general, mostly due to the Lydia and Wickham situation because he's now indebted to Mr. Gardiner. Because he comes to the conclusion that he did pay a hefty amount of money in order to convince Mr. Wickham to marry Lydia. Okay. At the same time, Mrs. Bennet is very excited for Lydia's and Wickham elopement. She begins planning the wedding, excited that she's gonna come down, and that finally one of her 5 daughters, is finally going to get married, because she will be the first one to be married. And she has, dreamt of this ever since Jane was born. So she's very ecstatic over it. Although meanwhile, Elizabeth is thinking about Mr. Darcy. She's very confused. Her opinion of him changed completely. She starts thinking like, oh, he would have been a great husband. We would have been perfect for each other. He's the only man, like that I could have made it work with. But, she thinks she's never going to see him again anytime soon. And then the family gets a letter from Mr. Gardiner explaining that Mr. Wickham is going to switch generals with a different regiment up in North. So Lydia and him will be moving there and living there. And by this, Mrs. Bennet is very sad about. So she convinces Mr. Bennet, who had previously said that he didn't want to show any sign of affection towards Lydia for what she has done. Like, he didn't want to buy her clothes for her wedding. But Mrs. Bennet convinces him due to the fact that she will be moving far away and probably she won't come down and see them often. And that's in chapter 8. So the beginning of chapter 9 begins with Lydia and Wickham arriving with the Bennets. So you notice, as you're reading, that Jane and Elizabeth are very uncomfortable, mostly because, Lydia's her usual self, and she's acting like she didn't cause any trouble. She's acting like she's oblivious to the trouble she made. And Mr. Wickham is acting like nothing happened. So everyone's acting normal and it's just off. And so while they're sitting down and talking, Elizabeth gets so annoyed by Lydia because Lydia's being very annoying, talking about how she's so happy and she's so in love and she just doesn't know the situation at all. So Elizabeth gets up and she leaves. She's done with it. She can't take it any longer. So when she finds him again, she overhears Lydia tell Jane, "Oh, Jane, take your place. I'm higher than you now because I am married. And I'm the first one married." And this kind of shows the social the social status you gain as a woman from being married, because Lydia's only about 16 years old and Jane is the oldest. Yet Lydia's here telling Jane that, now she's down here despite her being the oldest just because Lydia is married. So after that, Lydia tells Lizzie, "Oh, you didn't have the chance to hear about my wedding because you left so abruptly." And Elizabeth is like, "Oh, no, thank you. I'd rather not hear about your wedding." But Lydia insists, and so they sit down and they talk. And so Lydia starts talking about the day of her wedding and how everyone was in such a hurry. She was very confused because she just couldn't wait to get married, and she didn't understand why Mr. Gardiner and Wickham were talking so much and in such a hurry. And then she mentions that Mr. Darcy attended the wedding and that he was there that day, and more specifically that morning, and he stayed for the wedding. Elizabeth is very confused by this. She doesn't understand why Mr. Darcy would attend Mr. Wickham's wedding. And so she decides to write a letter to Mrs. Gardiner demanding an explanation for why Mr. Darcy would attend the wedding. So that's the end of chapter 9. So through chapter 9, I noticed that Lydia's being very annoying. And then it just comes back to bite her, because she also mentions that she hopes that her sisters Jane and Elizabeth get as lucky as she does, which is very ironic because Wickham is marrying her for the money that he's being given by Mr. Gardiner. And yeah, it's just ironic. That's the end of chapter 9. I also forgot to mention that when Lydia let out the part of Mr. Darcy attending her wedding, she kind of freaked out, saying, "Oh, please don't tell anyone I told you. Mr. Wickham told me to swear that I wouldn't tell anyone." So that whole part was meant to be a secret. All right, so chapter 10 begins with Elizabeth getting her letter from Mrs. Gardiner. In the letter, Mrs. Gardiner states that Mr. Darcy was the one who paid for Wickham to marry Lydia. And she also hints that he did it out of his love for Elizabeth. So that's it's a lot of information in the letter. So basically Darcy goes, tells them that he knows where Mr. Wickham and Lydia are. He then they go on and find them. He goes talk to Lydia to try to get her to quit her disgraceful position, but she refuses to leave Wickham's side. So then he goes talk to Mr. Wickham to work out the situation and to convince him to marry Lydia. And he does end up convincing him. So Mr. Gardiner at first is very reluctant to allow him to pay for that, but Mrs. Gardiner hints that that Darcy was able to convince Mr. Gardiner because he saw the love Mr. Darcy had for Elizabeth, which is why he let him pay. And so that's basically what happens. And then Mrs. Gardiner goes on to say that she really approves of Mr. Darcy and he really does like him. He's a good person. So after Elizabeth is done reading the letter from Mrs. Gardiner, she leaves and she bumps into Mr. Wickham. And in this part, Mr. Wickham is trying to save himself because he hears that she met Mr. Darcy. She met Miss Darcy, and that she went to Pemberley. So at this point, I believe Mr. Wickham already knows that Elizabeth knows everything about him, and he tries to save his butt, by saying, "Oh, Miss Darcy changed a lot in the last year. Maybe, but when I met her, she was very disagreeable person. Maybe she's nice now, or oh, I could have been a minister, but it just didn't work out." When Elizabeth knows that he just wanted the money. And that's the end of chapter 11. Oh, also, after Elizabeth reads the letter, her reaction to it is thinking how he did this for her, because she kind of did believe that he did it for her, for a girl that didn't esteem him, and I don't know, she felt very proud of him for doing it. So you can tell she's now falling for him in this section. And yeah, she feels very proud of him, and he earned a lot of brownie points from this action. So props to him. And yeah. So for the theme, I was gonna do love at first, just love, but I decided to do love and family. So not only love because it's a love romance novel, but love love between Darcy and Elizabeth, between Mr. Bennet and Jane, but I also wanted to do love between family, between Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth, the love between Elizabeth and Jane, even the odd love that Mrs. Bennet has for her daughters. And so the quote I chose for the theme is, is referring to the gardeners. So the book states, Darcy as well as Elizabeth really loved them, and they were both very sensible towards the persons who had been the means of uniting them. So they refer to Mrs. Gardiner. So they both love them, because not only did they bring them together, but basically they brought them together. But it's their family, and they have a very close connection. I would even argue that Mr. Gardiner was more of a father in a way towards Elizabeth than Mr. Bennet himself, mostly because he took responsibility and action. And yeah, that's a theme, love and family. All right, so this is a mobile I made. I'm gonna try to explain everything without it falling apart. Okay, so let's see. So I did a little cross to represent, back then everyone was Christian. They heavily believed in God, and their morals were very Christian based. I did money. It was a big influencer. Not only does it represent the social class of back then, but also the fact that Mr. Darcy paid for Mr. Wickham's. And it just shows the importance of money back then, and what your social status was. I did a ring to represent marriage, because it's a very heavily, that's basically the theme of the novel, in my opinion, other than love, of course. But I did the ring to represent marriage. I did the horse because they used horses back then, and that's their way of getting places, I did a tree because to represent Elizabeth, basically, because Elizabeth, you could, throughout the book, she kind of is represented by nature, because she's very free-spirited, open-minded, independent. So that's why I did this tree. I did the heart to represent the love found in this book, the love Mr. Darcy holds for Elizabeth and vice versa, Mr. Bingley and Jane's love for each other. Those are the main love interests in the story. I did a mask to represent Mr. Wickham, because he puts a mask on of charisma to not show his true self, which is, I believe, pathetic. He's a coward, but to represent Wickham. I put a rose to represent the love and the passion, and it just represents love, and yeah, that's for Darcy, to represent Darcy's and Elizabeth's love. I did lipstick, a very bad lipstick, by the way, but I did lipstick to represent vanity, seen in Lydia and Kitty, and just vanity, because the way they are. I did a watch to represent time, because it took time for Elizabeth to fall for Mr. Darcy. She wasn't all over him just because he had money. It actually took time to get to know his character and get to know who he truly is. And I think that's everything on this. And yeah, this is a mobile. Am I missing anything?